East of the city, the mountains of Jerusalem plummet dramatically 1,200 meters to the lowest point on earth, the Dead Sea. In the intense heat of the barren Judean desert, David fled from King Saul, seeking refuge in the mountain caves. John the Baptist lived on locusts and wild honey. And here, Jesus rejected the temptations of the devil. For thousands of years, the Judean desert held secrets buried in its sands. In 1947, a young Bedouin shepherd threw a stone into a cave and was startled by the sound of breaking pots. This sound echoed around the world, for he had stumbled on the greatest find of the century, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Blind to their value, the Bedouins sold the scrolls to an antique dealer in Bethlehem, Khalil Eskandar Shaheen, a shoemaker and part-time antique dealer, locally known as Kando.
The Bedouin, it's rumored, wanted to use the scroll to repair his sandals. He wanted to make straps, leather straps. And Kando, being a professional, told him that it wouldn't do. I mean, the scrolls are very fragile and they wouldn't make good straps. But on the other hand, they can bring money.
At his house in Bethlehem, Kando wouldn't verify this rumor. In fact, he wouldn't even talk to us. But we do know that he agreed to act for the Bedouin for a modest fee.
Yes.
Modest, considering that antiquities trading was strictly black market. The British Mandate authorities in Palestine at that time demanded that all relics should be passed on directly to them for an even more modest fee. The Bedouin returned to the desert to rummage the cave for a second time, while Kando cast around for a buyer. Some weeks later, the Bedouin came back with 4 more scrolls. But deciding to hedge their bets, they only gave 1 to Kando and sold the remaining 3 to a second merchant for the kingly sum of 7 Palestinian pounds. Kando, thinking the writing might be ancient Syrian script, brought his 4 scrolls to the Metropolitan of the Syrian Orthodox Church in Jerusalem, Mar Athanasius Samuel. It was here at St. Mark's Monastery in the Old City that Mar Samuel purchased them, hoping they were early Christian texts.
And Kando sent these books by a person, his servant, called George, to the bishop here. And the bishop, at that time, when he got them, was a monk.
By November 1947, the British Mandate of Palestine was turning sour. Traveling, especially in Jerusalem, was becoming a problem. And with tempers rising on Jewish and Arab sides, the British cordoned Jerusalem into separate zones, with barbed wire fences and military passes controlling movement. On November 23rd, Elazar Sukenik, professor of archaeology at the Hebrew University, received an urgent phone call from a friend, an Armenian antique dealer from the Old City. He insisted they meet immediately. Without a pass, Sukenik could not travel to the other side of the city. He took his first look at the ancient parchment through the barbed wire as he listened to the story of the find. Recognizing the antiquity of the script, he determined to buy the scrolls for the university if he could only see the originals. But that meant traveling to Bethlehem, deep in hostile Arab territory. Next morning, Sukenik left for Bethlehem. Meeting up with his Armenian friend at the depot in East Jerusalem, they boarded the bus, Sukenik the only Jewish passenger. Despite the dangers, they completed the transaction and were on their return journey by afternoon, 3 scrolls wrapped inconspicuously in newspaper on Sukenik's lap. He sat quietly the whole journey, convinced it was destiny that was bringing the texts written before the destruction of the last Jewish state 1900 years before back into Jewish hands, now on the eve of the rebirth of the State of Israel. That same night, riots broke out. During the months of turmoil that followed, Sukenik and a small team at the Hebrew University began the delicate task of unrolling scrolls stuck together by 20 centuries of decomposition. Slowly, their identity began to appear. The Book of Isaiah, a 24-feet long scroll, an almost complete manuscript. written only 500 years after Isaiah spoke these words. It is almost identical to the Bible that we have today. 25 hymns of thanksgiving, similar to the Psalms, but in a language of their own. The third manuscript, 19 badly mutilated columns that gave a detailed battle plan of a prophetic 40-year war, the war of the children of light against the children of darkness, the final battle when good triumphs forever over evil. As the contents of the texts became clear, the question arose, who wrote them? Sukenik's thoughts turned to the first-century historian Josephus Flavius, who described Jewish sect, the Essenes.
Before the sun rises, they utter not a word on secular affairs, but offer prayers as if beseeching him to appear.
This is how Josephus, who himself claims to have been an Essene, describes their life. The Essenes, a highly disciplined hierarchical sect of mainly celibate men, following a solar calendar that gave them a Jewish life of their own. A 3-year probation awaited anyone wanting to join the sect. As Professor Sukenik searched out these references, Bishop Samuel still searched for an expert to identify his scrolls. In February 1948, Mar Samuel finally approached Sukenik. Meeting here at the YMCA, Sukenik was shown 4 scrolls. As he unrolled the edge of one, these words jumped out to him.
The book of the community rule. He shall admit into the covenant of grace all those who have freely devoted themselves to the observance of God's precepts, that they may be joined to the counsel of God.
Sukenik's interest, however, had finally confirmed the scroll's authenticity, and Samuel wasted no time in contacting AZOR, the American School of Oriental Research. He hoped the Americans would come up with a better offer. In 1948, John Trevor, acting director of the American School in Jerusalem, unexpectedly came into possession of what happened to be a group of ancient manuscripts. Not knowing what they were, he sought to ascertain their authenticity. Trevor made photographs of the scrolls and called Professor W.F. Albright of Johns Hopkins University, America's leading biblical scholar.
And he called them out and he told them the same, that some mysterious scrolls were found. One was opened and it looks like this is a biblical scroll. And the other, he says, is a non-biblical scroll. And we tried to read in it something, but we don't make sense.
And Albright titled this unknown scroll, The Manual of Discipline.
He called the press and he declared, this is the greatest archaeological discovery ever made.
We have here in the Scroll of Discipline an account of the beliefs and practices of the Essenes, and in
These texts were revolutionizing the entire field of biblical studies and were setting the academic world on fire.
We're going to know 100 times more about the background in Judaism of the New Testament than we ever dreamed we would.
Their antiquity proven, Mar Samuel promptly disappeared together with his scrolls. But news of the discovery sent archaeologist Father Roland Devaux, as well as Bedouin treasure hunters, racing to excavate the area. From Cave 4 alone, dug out of the sheer face of an escarpment, the Bedouin removed about 15,000, mostly tiny fragments. The remains, 500 scrolls. Other caves delivered up different treasures. Sandals, cloth, and combs showed that some were used as dwellings. In one of the most exciting finds, archaeologists unearthed a unique 2-part copper scroll, listing sites of buried treasure of gold and silver, an enigma unraveled to this day. The Rockefeller Museum building in Jerusalem became home to the abundant fragments of disintegrating parchment collected from 11 caves. Director of the nearby École Biblique, part of the Dominican monastic order, Father Devaux formed an international team of scholars to work on the scrolls in the Rockefeller Museum. The team identified most books of the Old Testament, books of external wisdom, not included when the Old Testament was authorized in its present form, and texts attributed to the Jewish sect. A few lines from 1st century Roman geographer Pliny the Elder were the only clue to the site of the sect's community.
On the western shore of the Dead Sea are settled the Essenes, a solitary people, extraordinary beyond all others, who live without women and without money, having only the palm trees for company.
Excavation of the ruins of Qumran revealed the remains of a large settlement, with jars identical to those that held the scrolls. Active from mid-2nd century BCE through to the year 68 CE, Qumran was finally destroyed by the Roman legions. Over 30 buildings, some originally 2 stories high, were uncovered. From the collapsed ruins of one upper room, a 5-meter mud brick and plaster table was reconstructed. When inkwells were discovered nearby, DeVos suggested that the room was a scriptorium, a room where scrolls were written and copied. The scribe's art has changed little down to our own day. Scrolls are still written by hand on the same kind of treated leather hides. A kitchen, mill, and baking oven, hundreds of dishes, bowls, and beakers fired in the potter's kilns. All these were uncovered, as well as a store of hundreds of coins. The scrolls state that the community shared all their possessions, and this hoard is thought to be part of the sect's common treasury. The texts never refer explicitly to the sect as Essenes, but call them the community of the New Covenant, the Sons of Light, or the followers of the Teacher of Righteousness. They give a highly detailed picture of the spiritual nature of the sect. The scroll of the community rule describes the binding oath its members annually renewed.
He shall admit into the covenant of grace all those who have freely devoted themselves to the observance of God's precepts, that they may be joined to the counsel of God.
That they may live perfectly before him, and love all the sons of light, and hate all the sons of darkness. The largest room at Qumran was identified as the community's assembly hall. The discovery of an adjacent pantry stacked with a large store of broken pottery dishes indicates that it was also used as the communal dining room. The assembly hall could be the location where the community oath was taken, and those wishing to join the sect were judged over 3 years of probation. Adherents breaking the strict rules of conduct faced penance or even expulsion. They practiced ritual purification in the large number of stepped ritual baths found throughout the settlement. The text of the community rule explains their importance.
He will cleanse him of all wicked deeds with a spirit of holiness. Like purifying waters, he will shed upon him the spirit of truth.
When his flesh is sprinkled with purifying water and sanctified by cleansing water, it shall be made clean by the humble submission of his soul to all the precepts of God. These rites of purification, the sharing of wealth and possessions, and the celebration of a sacred communal meal led many researchers to make a connection between the Essenes and the early Christians.
The Essenes shared their wealth, and the early church was a wealth-sharing group. The early church is governed by a council of 12, and there is a personage called an episkopos.
When they shall gather for the common table, the priest shall bless the first fruits of bread and wine. Thereafter the Messiah of Israel shall extend his hand over the bread, and all the congregation of the community shall utter a blessing.
This is the blueprint for the Last Supper. And the idea of Eucharist come later by the gospel writers. The idea that you are eating the bread as my body or the wine as my blood.
Differences of opinion occurred amongst scholars on almost every aspect concerning the scrolls, as well as on the nature of the Qumran settlement. DeVos and others saw the community as an Essene monastery. Several monasteries dating back to between the 4th and 6th century CE exist in the Judean desert.
the idea that a certain group decided to live monastic life, a cooperative life. It was of very great significance, especially if you remember that this is the first monastic community in the Western world.
As the results of the excavations interfaced with the contents of the scrolls, Devaux had the international team begin to draw a picture of Qumran, a picture which has become known as the consensus view. This view sees Qumran as a peaceful monastic retreat where the Essenes lived a life removed from the turmoil of the times of great social upheaval that gave birth to a new millennium.
We must be very careful of not imposing a monkish structure on Qumran. This is important because some of the earliest people writing on Qumran came from a monastic background and imposed their viewpoint on Qumran studies, and this was accepted. And therefore they saw them living in solitude and copying books all day as if they were a medieval monastery.
Adjacent to the site of Qumran, to its east, archaeologists discovered remains of an extensive cemetery. A few of the graves were excavated and revealed remains of individual burials. Surprisingly, some of the burials are of women and children. This data raises the question of the identity of the inhabitants of the site throughout its existence. By the early 1950s, Professor Sukhenik had died, and his work was taken up by his son, Yigael Yadin. Lecturing in America, Yadin's attention was captured by an advert in the Wall Street Journal. The 4 Dead Sea Scrolls, biblical manuscripts dating back to at least 200 BC, are for sale. Knowing they could only be Mar Samuel scrolls, Yadin immediately answered the ad.
Late spring saw the return to Israel of 4 more of the ancient Holy Scrolls, found by shepherds in a cave at the edge of the Dead Sea.
Thus Yadin closed the circle begun by his father. The final price, $250,000.
In Jerusalem, Prime Minister Moshe Sharet and his Director General examined the scrolls and announced that the government would build a shrine of the book to house the entire collection, 7 in all, on the campus of the Hebrew University. The Dead Sea Caves supply a missing chapter to the proud history of the Jews in the Holy Land.
The Shrine of the Book is part of the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. Its roof, like the lid of the jar the scrolls were buried in, its gentle white slope opposite the black angular monolith, reflecting the eternal struggle between good and evil. Walking between the two, steps lead down to subterranean chambers, where special lighting and controlled humidity preserve the ancient scrolls. The whole museum acts not only as a showcase for the public, but also as a research center open to scholars from around the world, actively promoting publication of all the works on the scrolls. But this was not the case just 2 miles away, across the Jordanian border, at the Rockefeller Museum in East Jerusalem, where hundreds of manuscripts were the private domain of only 8 scholars, the international team. The manuscripts, pressed between sheets of glass, were for years subject to direct sunlight and changes in temperature, their condition slowly deteriorating. In November 1966, the Jordanian government nationalized the Rockefeller Museum, and the Dead Sea Scrolls became Jordanian property. This act would have repercussions when the museum passed into Israeli hands. In June 1967, the Six-Day War broke out.
Mandelbaum Gate and its vicinity were taken. The next objectives were the Damascus Gate and the Rockefeller Museum.
On the second day of the war, Israeli paratroopers fought a bloody battle to take the Rockefeller Museum, used by the Jordanian army for its strong strategic position. After heavy fighting, the museum fell before the Israeli advance. The Western Wall was in Jewish hands. So too, the treasures of Jewish history, the Dead Sea Scrolls.
The Rockefeller Museum, facing the old city.
With fighting still in progress, Yigael Yadin procured a jeep and an army escort and drove down to Bethlehem. For years, he had suspected that a scroll was still in the possession of Kando, the antique dealer. Faced by Yadin, Kando unearthed the shoebox, hidden under his kitchen floor. Opening the box, he handed Yadin the longest scroll ever seen. Over 8 meters long, decomposing, and with insects eating away at the precious leather. This temple scroll proved to be one of the most important of all sectarian texts. The temple scroll was the 8th to come into Israeli hands. With the annexation of East Jerusalem, a wealth of archaeological treasure came under the responsibility of the Israeli Department of Antiquities. The jewel in the crown of this treasure were the 800 scrolls and thousands of fragments. But when the Israelis went into the basement of the museum, they were shocked to find scrolls disintegrating from lack of preservation facilities.
In this room we have scrolls which are not published yet and on which scholars are working still. I will just show you a few examples of the things that we have here.
Preserved naturally by the unique desert conditions for 2,000 years, scrolls easily began disintegrating if overexposed to air, humidity, and sunlight.
But we have found out that the glass is not good for them, and the glue with which they are stuck with, I'll just show you the examples. This is the glue and the sellotape with which they were put together.
Today, these priceless parchments are kept in specially designed and carefully monitored environments to ensure their best protection. Engaged in an equally difficult task are the scholars attempting the enormous jigsaw puzzle of restoring manuscripts from tiny fragments.
And the other one, this group is
Professor Father Emile Poueche of the École Biblique incorporated fragments originally published by Sukenik into one manuscript he was working on, with surprising results.
You find a very similar composition to what you find in the Gospel, in the Christian scriptures. And for instance, I have in this beginning of column here 5, 6, 7, or 8 beatitudes, like in Matthew.
Today, over 50 scholars worldwide continue to work on bringing the fragments to publication. Most scroll restoration is done by the skill of eye and hand, often aided by an intimate knowledge of the handwriting of different scribes. All the large and relatively complete manuscripts first discovered are exhibited at the Shrine of the Book at the Israel Museum and were published in full. However, the numerous fragments later discovered in the Judean desert caves were brought to the Rockefeller Museum building and required an extensive process of sorting, deciphering, and piecing together. To this end, an international group of scholars was engaged and spent years of intense work on preparing the material for publication. However, as this work seemed to be taking too long, in 1988, the Israel Antiquities Authority enlarged the number of scholars occupied with the work to 57. The final publication is targeted for 1997, half a century after the first discovery.
As usual, I find the older ones.
Here at the Ancient Biblical Manuscript Center in Claremont, California, they believe in computer technology. Together with state-of-the-art companies, they are developing digital enhanced computer imaging. With photographs of the scrolls in computer data banks, it is possible for artificial intelligence to match fragments to one another in ways impossible for the scholars working only with their hands and eyes.
What we've done is we've made an outline of this piece. You see, there it is, and we rotated it, and now we're taking our outline and we're moving it up where it belongs, so we can put this fragment back where it originally fit. I have done this manually, and it took me about a better part of a day. Now you can take such fragments electronically, and you can move them without moving the text itself. You can move the fragments around like it was a giant jigsaw puzzle. This is revolution. People will not imagine how we ever did it the old way, just like people say, I can't imagine what life was like before word processing or air conditioning, you know? They're going to say the same thing about the way we study ancient texts, especially Dead Sea Scrolls.
While some put their faith in technology, Others trust the powers of nature, hoping that the earthquakes which periodically strike the Qumran area will one day open new caves.
I think I can say there are still scrolls, mostly in collapsed caves, and one day these will come to light. It'll be very exciting. I would like some pre-exilic biblical manuscripts, some old ones. Let's say Jeremiah from the 7th century. How would you like that?
Thus, it seems, we come full circle in the complexities of trying to understand the past. But who lived there? And why did they retreat to the harsh desert wilderness? Did they write the scrolls? Or was it Jerusalem's temple library, hidden from the advancing Roman legions? Were they peace-loving scribes in a monastic retreat? Or a militant order active in the resistance? As evidence, some point to the sectarian scrolls found in the nearby Masada fortress. The Israel Antiquities Authority continues excavations at the site of Qumran and the nearby caves, in the hope that further scrolls still remain buried, hoping to complete the picture of this fateful time on the eve of the destruction of the Second Temple and the birth of Christianity. Whatever the outcome of academic debates, technologies, or new discoveries, the words of this ancient community have already given our world much to meditate upon.
Until now, the spirits of truth and falsehood struggle in the hearts of men, and they walk in both wisdom and folly. For God has established the two spirits in equal measure until the renewal, when there shall be no more lies, and all the works of falsehood shall be put to shame.